He thought it was just a small gesture, a soldier quietly paying for a stranger's meal in a dusty little diner. No speeches, no thanks, just a nod and silence. But the next morning, a knock at his door changed everything. A plain cardboard box sat waiting, and what he found inside left him shaken, humbled, and in tears. How could one simple act of kindness return in a way so powerful it carried decades of sacrifice, memory, and love? This is a story of what was inside that box. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The diner was the kind of place that felt unchanged by time. Its vinyl booths were patched with strips of tape that had long since lost their stick. The ceiling fan circled a lazy hum, and the smell of grease clung to walls no matter how often the windows were cracked open. It was not a place people traveled to. It was simply there, an anchor for truck drivers, night shift workers, and the scattered souls who needed a meal without questions. In the corner, near the window fogged by the morning chill, a man in uniform sat alone with his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. He had returned from deployment only a few weeks before, though to him the days blurred into one another, like dust storms across the desert he had left behind. His name was Daniel Hayes, though no one in the diner knew it. To them, he was simply the soldier, another face in a country that sent men and women away and brought them back quieter than when they had left. His posture was straight, but not rigid, his eyes scanning the room out of habit more than interest. Years of training had carved vigilance into him like a second nature. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a pencil tucked behind her ear, filled his cup without asking. She had seen him enough times to know he rarely ordered more than eggs and toast, sometimes skipping the meal altogether in favor of endless refills of black coffee. He offered her a polite nod, the kind that acknowledged her kindness without inviting conversation. She moved on, leaving him to the low murmur of the other patrons. Outside, the town still carried the marks of a long recession. Boarded storefronts lined the main street, and the gas station across the road advertised prices that had climbed beyond what most locals could manage with ease. Inside the diner, people wore the expressions of those used to making do. They spoke of bills, of layoffs, of relatives moving away in search of steadier work. Daniel listened without meaning to, his mind cataloging voices the way he once tracked radio chatter. Yet here, unlike overseas, the talk held no urgency. It was simply the weight of ordinary lives pressed into words. Daniel's uniform was neat, though softened by repeated washings. He wore it not to draw attention, but because it was one of the few things he owned that still fit and carried a sense of order. Civilian clothes felt foreign on his shoulders. In the reflection of the diner's window, he looked older than his 30 years. The lines around his eyes cut deeper than they should have been. Sleep had not yet returned to him fully, and the quiet of small-town nights was often broken by memories that refused to let go. He stirred his coffee, though he never added sugar, simply for the motion, for the sense of occupying his hands. The steam rose into his face, warm but carrying nothing of comfort. Across the room, a group of teenagers laughed too loudly at something on a phone screen, their lives untouched by the kind of places Daniel had seen. At another booth, an elderly couple shared a single plate, the man cutting the food into small portions for his wife. Each detail of the diner settled into Daniel's awareness, not because he sought it, but because he could not help noticing. For all his composure, there was an exhaustion that clung to him, not the kind solved by rest, but the deeper weariness of carrying too much silence. He spoke rarely, answered when asked, but otherwise moved through each day as though conserving what little energy he had left. People offered thanks sometimes, noticing the uniform. He always nodded politely, never lingering on their gratitude. Words of thanks did not fill the spaces left by those who never made it home. The jukebox in the corner crackled to life with a song too old for most of the patrons to recognize. Daniel let it wash over him, another sound layered into the atmosphere of ordinary life. He wanted to feel at home in it, to let the routine of small-town mornings steady him, but the weight of memory pressed down, unspoken but constant. When the waitress returned with his plate, he thanked her softly, his voice low, carrying more sincerity than volume. He ate slowly, methodically, as though each bite was less about hunger and more about grounding himself in the present. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the kitchen grill, the scrape of forks against chipped china. These were the sounds he held on to, reminders that he was here and not elsewhere. From the outside, he looked like any man passing through, a quiet customer keeping to himself. But beneath the surface, every detail of the room, every movement of the people within it, stitched into a tapestry of awareness. He blended into the corner not because he wished to disappear, but because it was easier than explaining the things he carried. In that booth, with a coffee cooling in his hands and the way of his uniform across his shoulders, Daniel Hayes looked less like a soldier returned home and more like a man still searching for where home might be. The bell above the diner door gave a half-hearted jingle as it swung open, letting in a gust of cold air that carried with it the scent of rain-soaked asphalt. The few patrons already inside barely looked up. The morning crowd was small, an older man reading a newspaper by the window, the group of teenagers still laughing over their phones, the couple sharing a plate, and the soldier in the corner, steady and silent. But Daniel's eyes, sharpened by years of scanning unfamiliar streets, engaging strangers in instant, flicked to the doorway the way they always did. The figure who entered carried the weight of fatigue in every step. A woman in her late 30s, hair pulled back hastily, with a child trailing behind her clutching a worn backpack. They were not out of place exactly. People from all walks of life found themselves in small-town diners, but something about their presence stirred a quiet recognition in Daniel. He had seen that particular set of the shoulders before, the way someone walked when they were doing their best to appear steady while the ground shifted beneath them. The woman guided the boy to a booth near the counter, murmuring something meant to sound cheerful, though the strain showed in her voice. She pulled a wallet from her coat pocket and opened it with the care of someone measuring every choice. Her fingers lingered on the bills inside, thumb brushing over the edges, as though counting and recounting would somehow change the outcome. Daniel did not stare. He never did, but his awareness settled on them the way his training had always demanded, observant without intrusion, attentive without needing to act. The waitress came over with her pad balanced against her palm, ready to rattle off the day's breakfast specials. The woman asked about prices first, her tone careful, almost apologetic. The boy scanned the menu with the kind of hunger that made his eyes widen at every item, but when his mother gave him a look, he closed the menu quickly and nodded as if to say, "Whatever you choose is fine." Daniel recognized that nod. He had made it himself as a boy, sitting across from his own mother in places where a full meal was a luxury, where choosing water instead of soda helped stretch $1 a little farther. The order they settled on was small: toast, coffee for the mother, orange juice for the boy. No mention of eggs or bacon, though the boy's eyes had paused on the pictures. The waitress, perhaps accustomed to such requests, scribbled it down without comment, though Daniel noticed a faint softening of her expression, the almost imperceptible pause before she moved away. Daniel shifted in his seat, his coffee cooling before him. He felt no pity for them. Pity was too distant, too hollow. What he felt instead was recognition, like watching an echo of something already lived. Hardship wore many uniforms. Not all of them made of camouflage. He remembered patrols where rations had been scarce, meals divided unevenly to make sure the youngest or weakest had enough strength to keep moving. He remembered men giving away their share without a word, because survival often depended on quiet sacrifices no one else would notice. The scene before him felt no different, only translated into the language of ordinary life. The boy took a sip of his orange juice slowly, as though rationing even that. His mother wrapped her hands around the coffee cup when it arrived, letting the warmth seep into her fingers, her shoulders easing just slightly. They spoke little, their silence filled with the unspoken understanding that came from long months, perhaps years, of scraping by together. Daniel lowered his gaze, giving them privacy, but his ears picked up fragments of their conversation. A mention of a bus schedule, a half-formed question about where they might go next, the reassurance that they would figure it out. The soldier did not move to act. Not yet. He had learned that sometimes stepping forward too quickly could strip people of the dignity they were trying so hard to hold on to. Instead, he sat with the knowledge, letting it settle in him like a stone at the bottom of a well. Their struggle was not his to solve, and yet it resonated with something deep in his chest, something that had not quieted since he returned. He had been trained to notice weakness, not to exploit it, but to shield it, to account for it in the calculus of survival. Watching the mother and son, he felt that same instinct awaken, steady and undeniable. Around them, the diner carried on in its rhythm. Plates clattered from the kitchen. A trucker called for more coffee. The teenagers erupted in another burst of laughter that seemed almost obscene in its volume. But Daniel's attention, no matter how he tried to spread it, always returned to the booth across the room. He knew the look in the boy's eyes, the measured hope in the mother's voice, and the quiet weight of making do with less. It was a scene he had seen in refugee camps overseas, in barracks where supplies ran thin, and now here, in the middle of his own country, on a gray morning where nothing seemed remarkable except the way hardship lingered like a shadow. He lifted his mug again, sipped the bitter coffee, and let the decision form quietly inside him, not with drama or urgency, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done when the moment arrived. For now, he remained still, watching, understanding, carrying the recognition without judgment. The soldier and the stranger, each bound by different battles, sat in the same room, their paths about converge in ways neither of them yet understood. The meal had been simple, hardly more than a pause in a difficult morning. Toast sat in crumbs on the boy's plate, the orange juice gone in careful sips. His mother had drained her coffee slowly, stretching it as though the warmth alone was worth the price. They spoke in quiet tones, almost conspiratorial, sharing a glance now and then that carried more between them than words could. Daniel watched without staring, letting the scene filter into the periphery of his awareness while his own plate cooled in front of him. He had long since finished eating, but he lingered, coffee in hand, giving no outward sign of impatience. When the waitress returned with a check, the woman reached for her wallet. Her hands betrayed her in their hesitation. She opened it carefully, sliding her fingers along the edges of folded bills, pausing, counting once, then again as if to confirm the number hadn't changed. Her face remained composed, but Daniel saw the small crease at the corner of her mouth, the kind of line carved not by age but by constant worry. The boy sat still, pretending not to notice. He fiddled with the zipper on his backpack, eyes fixed downward, as though if he didn't look up he could avoid the truth of how tight things really were. The waitress, polite but brisk, laid the bill on the table and moved on, leaving them with the quiet weight of the moment. Daniel knew that expression on the mother's face, the quick calculation of what must be sacrificed for what, a decision about whether today's bus fare could still be covered, whether tomorrow's meal would have to be skipped. He didn't know the particulars, but he didn't need to. Hardship, he had learned, spoke a language that required no translation. He didn't think about what he was about to do. It came the way old instincts always did, without ceremony, without second-guessing. He slid from his booth just as the woman reached for the check, and his boots made a low sound against the tile that drew her eyes up in surprise. For a moment, their gazes met, hers uncertain, guarded, his steady but unassuming. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. With the same calm precision that had once carried him through routines halfway across the world, he stepped to the counter, lifted the check from the edge of her table, and set it down before the register. "I've got it," he said softly, barely more than a murmur. His voice held no flourish, no expectation of thanks. It was not the tone of a man announcing generosity, but of one stating a simple fact, as though the matter required no discussion. The woman's lips parted as if to protest, but she stopped herself. Pride flickered in her expression, the natural resistance of someone who had been forced too many times to accept less than what they deserved. Yet beneath it was exhaustion, and Daniel recognized how heavy it must feel to always fight. She gave a small nod instead, her eyes lowering in quiet surrender, or perhaps in gratitude she wasn't yet ready to show. The boy's gaze lingered on Daniel, wide and searching. There was no smile, no eager thank you, only a kind of watchfulness, as though he understood that something unspoken had passed between his mother and the soldier. Daniel gave him a brief nod in return, a gesture of acknowledgement, nothing more. He placed a few bills from his own wallet on the counter, enough to cover their meal and his, and accepted his change with a simple motion of the hand. He didn't linger at the register. He didn't wait for applause, or even a word. He turned back toward his booth, sliding once more into the corner seat, reclaiming his coffee cup as though nothing had happened. The waitress caught his eye briefly. Her expression softened by a small smile, but he offered nothing more than a polite dip of the head. Across the room, the woman pressed her hand against the checkered tabletop, steadying herself. She seemed caught between relief and unease, unsure how to carry the weight of a kindness she had not asked for. Daniel looked away, granting her the space to feel whatever she needed to feel. For him, it was already done, folded into the rhythm of his day like any other decision made on instinct. He had lived enough to know that generosity made into a spectacle lost something of its truth. He did not want her gratitude, nor did he expect it. In his mind, it was simply an action taken in a moment when it was needed. Nothing more, nothing less. He returned to his seat, to the bitter coffee that had grown lukewarm, to the ordinary quiet of the diner where conversations rose and fell without noticing him. The woman eventually gathered her son's backpack and her own coat. She gave one last glance toward the soldier in the corner, her lips tightening as if words rested on the edge of them, but none came. She guided the boy out into the gray morning, the door's bell giving its tired jingle again as it closed behind them. Daniel sat alone once more, his profile reflected faintly in the window glass. He reached for his cup, lifted it, and drank without expression. The gesture already faded from his mind, absorbed into the long line of actions he had taken in his life without expectation of recognition. For him, it was not kindness. It was simply what you did when you saw someone carrying too heavy a burden. And so he remained, steady and still, never imagining that this small moment would follow him beyond the diner's walls. The sound of the register drawer sliding shut seemed to echo louder than it should have, and though Daniel moved back to his booth with no ceremony, the small act had not gone unnoticed. In a place as small as that diner, gestures traveled quickly, even when no one spoke of them outright. The waitress glanced toward him again as she carried a tray of steaming plates past the counter, her eyes soft with recognition. She did not say a word, only set down the meals with a group of teenagers at the corner table, but the smallest curve of a smile tugged at her mouth before she turned away. At the table nearest the soldier's booth, an older man with a folded newspaper under his elbow leaned back, watching with a kind of approval that came from someone who had seen enough of life to value quiet kindness. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod, not to Daniel directly, but to the idea of what he had witnessed. Beside him, his companion, a woman with hair pulled into a careful bun, whispered something in his ear. Her voice was low, yet the way her eyes softened as they slid briefly toward Daniel told enough of her thoughts. Not everyone saw it the same way. One of the teenagers, still smirking from whatever joke had passed around their phone, rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath that drew a few snickers from his friends. To them, the gesture was not noble but unnecessary, perhaps even naive. They returned to their screens quickly, dismissing the soldier as another adult trying to make himself feel important. Daniel noticed, but he did not let it settle in him. He had long ago learned that most people saw only what they were ready to see, and approval or dismissal carried little weight compared to the act itself. The woman and her boy gathered their things quietly. The boy slid his backpack over his shoulder, glancing toward the corner where Daniel sat. His gaze lingered for a breath longer than his mother's, eyes full of something caught between wonder and caution. The mother's expression, by contrast, revealed very little. She smoothed the strap of her coat, buttoned it up to her chin, and guided her son toward the door with steady, practiced movements. If she felt relief, it did not show. If she felt gratitude, it remained folded deep within her, held back by pride or the simple need to keep moving forward. The bell over the door gave its tired jingle again as they stepped outside. A gust of cold air swept briefly into the room, carrying the faint smell of wet pavement and exhaust before the door swung shut. Through the window, Daniel could see them pause on the sidewalk. The boy looked up at his mother, speaking quickly with hands that moved in small gestures, but she only placed a hand on his shoulder and steered him forward, her face set against whatever thoughts pressed at her. They disappeared down the street, swallowed by the gray light of morning. Inside, the whispers continued in low tones. The couple with the newspaper spoke softly to one another, their words half covered by the scrape of forks against plates. The waitress leaned against the counter when her hands were free, telling another server what had happened in a voice that carried just enough for nearby patrons to overhear. To some, the story drew quiet smiles, the kind reserved for reminders that small goodness still existed in the world. To others, it was little more than background noise, a curiosity soon replaced by thoughts of their own errands and worries. Daniel remained in his seat, unmoved by either response. He kept his gaze on the coffee cooling in front of him, watching the surface tremble slightly each time the front door opened or a plate was set down too hard. He neither sought the nods of approval nor felt stung by the dismissals. For him, the act was already behind him, something done and released. Yet he knew, in a way words could not express, that the woman carried it with her now, tucked somewhere inside, as invisible and heavy as any burden she had carried into the diner. That was the nature of such moments, he thought. They did not end when the door closed or when the check was paid. They followed, unseen, reshaping the weight of a day, sometimes even of a life. He had no illusions that a meal could fix the larger struggles waiting for her outside. But he also knew that sometimes it was not about fixing. Sometimes it was only about easing the load for one step, giving enough strength to reach the next. The diner soon returned to its rhythm. Plates clattered in the kitchen. The jukebox stumbled into another song. The teenagers argued over something on their screen. The whispers faded, absorbed into the hum of ordinary life. Daniel shifted back in his seat, finishing the last sip of coffee, his expression unreadable. Across the room, no one looked at him directly anymore. The moment had already become a memory, a small story for others to carry away as they pleased. For the woman and her son, however, it was different. They had left with more than the remnants of toast and coffee. They carried a gesture not asked for, not explained, but offered freely. And though their faces betrayed nothing as they disappeared into the cold morning, Daniel suspected that the quiet weight of it would remain long after the taste of the meal had faded. The narrow staircase creaked beneath Daniel's boots as he climbed to the second floor of the boarding house where he rented a room. The building smelled faintly of old wood and boiled cabbage, a mixture of past tenants and present ones lingering in the halls. His key stuck in the lock, as it always did, the metal catching before giving way with a reluctant click. Inside, the room was no more than 12 feet by 10, a square space with a single bed pressed against one wall, a dresser with a missing drawer, and a folding chair set near the window. A small desk, salvaged from someone's curb, stood in the corner, its surface scarred with knife marks and rings from coffee cups. He set his jacket on the back of the chair, unlaced his boots, and placed them neatly by the bed. The discipline had never left him. Even in a place no one else would see, he maintained the habits that had carried him through years of service. He pulled a rag from the drawer and began wiping down the boots, removing the fine layer of dust from the morning walk. The polish had dulled, the leather cracked at the bends, but he cared for them as if they were still part of a uniform inspection. Some things, he believed, did not change simply because the setting had. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside and the shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. He moved with slow precision, each task performed not out of necessity, but to anchor himself in routine. Folding the spare uniform on the dresser, he pressed the creases with careful hands, smoothing fabric that had seen more wear than it should. A stack of letters sat in a shoebox beneath the bed, each one begun but never finished, never sent. They were addressed to no one in particular, sometimes to men he had served with, sometimes to his mother who had long since passed, sometimes to himself. Words written in the dim light of restless nights, folded and tucked away before dawn, erased the courage to send them. He pulled one out now, not to read but to hold. The paper softened at the edges from being opened and closed too many times. A half-written sentence stared back at him, cut off mid-thought. He set it down, reached for another, found the same. Letters that carried fragments of memory, but never the whole story. He slid them back into the box, closing the lid with a quiet resignation. On the desk sat a small notebook where he kept a list of odd jobs. Shifts at the hardware store, occasional day labor, tutoring a neighbor's son in math when the boys struggled with schoolwork. He picked up a pen, checked off one task, and added another for the week ahead. His handwriting was blocky, careful, the kind drilled into him during years of filling reports under pressure. The memory of the diner returned in flashes. The woman's hesitant hand over her wallet, the boy's quiet eyes, the weight of the bill as he carried it to the counter. It drifted through his mind without stirring him from the rhythm of his work. He did not regret it, nor did he dwell on it. For him, it already slipped into the background, one action among countless others made on instinct. The world kept moving, and so did he. He heated a can of soup on the small hot plate near the window, the metal pan wobbling slightly on its surface. The meal was plain but filling enough, the kind of food that asked for nothing more than a spoon and a little salt. He ate at the desk, staring at the notes in his notebook without really reading them, the taste of the soup muted by the quiet that filled the room. When the dishes were washed and set to dry, he sat on the bed, leaned back against the wall, and closed his eyes. The room smelled faintly of boot polish and steam from the soup. Outside, voices drifted from the street below, the laughter of someone heading home late, the bark of a dog echoing in the distance. Daniel listened, letting the sounds of ordinary life wash over him. The act at the diner lingered faintly, but not as something extraordinary. It was simply part of the day, folded into the fabric of his life like polishing boots or folding a shirt. He neither sought to remember it nor tried to forget. It was survival to keep moving, to let moments pass without clinging to them. And so he breathed, steady and even, waiting for the next morning when the same patterns would begin again. Morning came softly, the pale light filtering through the thin curtains that never quite blocked the sun. Daniel woke before the alarm. As he always did, his body tuned to the rhythm of early rising long after his service had ended. He sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes, and reached for the pair of boots he had polished the night before. The ritual was steady, almost mechanical. Socks pulled tight, laces threaded with precision, the knot double-checked before he stood. He moved around the small rented room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to live with little and make each action count. On the desk sat his notebook, open to a page marked with the day's plans. A shift at the hardware store in the afternoon, an errand for Mrs. Callahan down the hall, and maybe a stop at the diner for coffee if there was time before work. He picked up the pen and added one more note, checked post office, before setting it down again. The days rarely held surprises. That was something he had grown accustomed to, the comfort of repetition, of a life pared down to tasks simple enough to be completed without thought. He rinsed his face at the small sink in the corner, wiped it dry with a towel that had grown thin from too many washes, and buttoned his shirt. Just as he reached for his jacket, the sound came, a knock at the door, sharp but not hurried. It startled him in its timing more than its volume. Visitors were rare, almost unheard of, and knocks usually meant the landlord or someone in the hall mistaking the room. He froze for a moment, listening. Silence followed, broken only by the faint creak of the old floorboards settling under the weight of the building. He crossed the room quietly, instinct making him cautious, and opened the door just enough to peer into the dim hallway. No one stood there, only the muted light from the stairwell and the faint smell of dust. But at the threshold sat a box. It was small, no larger than the span of his hands, the cardboard edges worn but intact. A strip of tape sealed it shut, and on the top, in careful handwriting, his name was written, Daniel Hayes. He stared at it for a long moment, the sight unfamiliar in a life that rarely delivered surprises. No return address, no indication of who might have left it. He bent down slowly, lifting it with both hands. It was light, yet something shifted inside with a soft weight. Not the rattle of loose contents, but the solid movement of items placed deliberately. He stepped back into his room, closing the door with his heel, and set the box on the desk. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the handwriting. He traced the letters with his thumb, feeling the indentation of the pen on the cardboard. Whoever had written it had pressed firmly with intent. He searched his memory for anyone who might have sent him something, but no names came to mind. He had cut ties with most of his past, friends scattered, family distant. Packages did not arrive for him. His first thought was mistake. The box was meant for someone else, delivered to the wrong door. Yet the spelling of his name was exact. The letters clear, not guessed or scribbled. It was meant for him. That fact settled in his chest with both unease and curiosity. He lifted it again, testing the weight, turning it slightly to hear the muted shift inside. Still, he did not open it. Training had instilled caution in him. And though he knew he was no longer in a place where such vigilance was necessary, old habits lingered. He set the box back down, pulled the chair from the desk, and sat, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the plain cardboard, as if it might reveal its purpose, without needing to be touched further. Outside, the hallway creaked with footsteps, a door slammed, and life continued as usual. But inside his room, the presence of the box altered the air. The routine he had counted on, the structure that carried him through each day, wavered. The soldier in him wanted to analyze, to question, to wait. The man in him felt a pull he could not name, a quiet urge to open it and see. He leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving the handwriting on the top. The name stared back at him, unmistakably his. And with it came the realization that something had entered his life from beyond the narrow lines he had drawn for himself. What it carried, he could not yet know. But as the morning light shifted across the desk, warming the cardboard, he understood one thing with certainty. Whatever rested inside had found its way to him for a reason, and it was waiting. Daniel sat at the desk with the box in front of him, the cardboard edges catching the weak light that filtered through the curtains. His name, written in neat but deliberate handwriting, seemed almost out of place in his small, sparsely furnished room. He rested his hands on either side of it, fingers grazing the tape, but he did not pull at the seam. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, letting the silence of the room settle around him. The hum of traffic outside was faint, muffled by the walls, but in here the air felt still, thick with expectation. He turned the box once, then again, studying it from every angle. His military training had left him with an instinct that rarely allowed him to take anything at face value. Packages left on thresholds had once meant something very different. He had been taught to check for weight distribution, for wires, for signs of tampering. Old lessons stirred in his mind now, though logic reminded him that this was a small New England town, not a forward operating base. Still, he couldn't shake the habit of caution. The handwriting drew his eye most of all. It was steady, the strokes firm, not rushed. Whoever wrote it had pressed hard enough for the pen to leave indentations. It wasn't the handwriting of a stranger scribbling quickly in passing. There was intent in it. He traced the letters of his name with a calloused fingertip, as though the shape of each curve might tell him something about the sender. Nothing came, except the sense that whoever had written it knew exactly who he was and meant for it to reach him without doubt. The tape was a single strip across the top, sealed firmly but not excessive. It was clean, unwrinkled, as though whoever sealed it had done so carefully. That detail unsettled him more than if it had been haphazardly thrown together. Care meant thought, and thought meant purpose. He tilted the box slightly, listening. The contents shifted with a muted weight, not loose objects clattering, but something solid inside, cushioned perhaps. He tested again, a slow, deliberate movement. The sound was soft, restrained, as though whatever was inside had been arranged to remain steady. His jaw tightened as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He could open it. With a single pull of the tape, the mystery would be gone. But part of him resisted. He had lived long enough to know that once something is revealed, it cannot be folded back into ignorance. The moment of not knowing held a strange safety. In this moment, the box could be anything, a gift, a mistake, a message. Once opened, it would become one thing and one thing only. He rose from the chair and carried the box to the bed, setting it down on the neatly folded blanket. He stared at it from a distance now, arms crossed, as though putting space between himself and it might quiet the unease. His eyes narrowed slightly, cataloging every detail of its appearance. No return address, no markings from a shipping company, just the cardboard, the tape, and his name. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he let out a long breath and rubbed his hands over his face. It had been years since something unexpected had arrived for him. His life had narrowed into a predictable pattern, each day defined by simple routines that left little room for surprise. This box disrupted that, and though a part of him longed to tear it open and be done with the wondering, another part clung to the hesitation, holding the decision back as though savoring the tension. He lifted it again, feeling the weight settle into his hands. It was lighter than it looked, though not empty. He balanced it, tilted it, pressed lightly against its sides. The cardboard gave under his touch, but the shape inside held firm. He wondered if the handwriting might stir a memory, if the curves of the letters resembled anyone he once knew, a fellow soldier, an old friend, a stranger who had watched him without his notice. The possibilities stretched in his mind, each one carrying its own quiet gravity. The hours passed slowly, his chores delayed as the box sat in the center of his small world. He returned it to the desk eventually, placed it squarely in the middle as though anchoring it there. The light shifted to the window, moving across its surface, changing its appearance as day edged toward afternoon. Still, he did not open it. Instead, he moved through the motions of his day, washing the dish from breakfast, straightening the bed, pulling on his jacket for errands, each action slower than usual, each pause leading him back to the side of the box, waiting patiently. It was not fear that kept him from tearing into it. It was something quieter, heavier, a knowledge that whatever rested inside carried a message, and messages had a way of changing things. For now, Daniel chose to live in the space between knowing and not knowing, his caution not just the echo of military habit, but the instinct of a man who understood how even the smallest box, left at the right door, could alter the shape of a life. The decision came without ceremony, as most decisions in Daniel's life did. He had circled the box long enough, letting it rest on the desk like a quiet intruder, and the weight of not knowing pressed harder than the risk of discovery. The light outside had shifted, filling the room with the cool gray of late afternoon. The box seemed to draw that dimness into itself, waiting for his hands. He sat at the desk, rolled up his sleeves, and placed both palms on the cardboard as if bracing himself. The tape gave a muted rip beneath his fingers, the sound loud in the stillness. He pulled slowly, careful not to tear the box more than necessary. Once the strip was loose, he folded it back neatly, pressing it against the side. Old habits, again, nothing wasted, everything contained. He eased the flaps open one at a time, each movement deliberate, as though some part of him still expected a surprise hidden beneath the cardboard. Something sharp, something dangerous. But what greeted him was silence and stillness. Inside lay a layer of brown paper, folded with care, covering the contents. It was not crumpled or careless stuffing. It had been arranged, corners tucked, the folds even. Daniel slid his hand along the edge, lifted it back, and set it gently on the desk. Beneath it, the contents revealed themselves one by one, not scattered but placed as if in deliberate order. The first thing he saw was a photograph, a small print, faded at the edges, its surface creased where it had been handled often. He lifted it carefully, holding it by the corners. The picture showed a man in uniform, decades earlier by the look of the cut and color, standing in front of a plain clapboard house. The man's face was stern, his shoulders squared, but his eyes carried a weariness Daniel recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who had been through things the world would never ask about, and yet carried on all the same. Written on the back, in ink faded but still legible, was a single line, asterisk for those who remember. Asterisk. Daniel set the photograph aside, his thumb tracing the edge once before releasing it. Beneath it lay a medal, tarnished but intact, resting inside a small velvet case worn smooth by time. He opened it and stared at the dull gleam of bronze. He knew the type, had seen medals like it pinned to uniforms during ceremonies, clutched in hands at funerals, passed down to children too young to understand. This one had been kept carefully, protected. He turned it over, noting the engraving, letters and numbers marking a unit long disbanded. He placed the medal gently on the desk, next to the photograph, and reached back into the box. His hand brushed against folded paper, heavier stock than the photograph, bound with a thin piece of twine. He pulled it free and untied it. Inside was a letter, written in long, careful handwriting. The ink was darker, fresher than the photograph scrawl. He did not read it yet. He only unfolded enough to see the neatness of the script, the way the lines marched evenly across the page. He set aside, its presence heavier than the metal, heavier even than the photograph. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth, lay a smaller object. He unwound the fabric slowly, revealing a pocket knife with a wooden handle, worn smooth by years of use. He pressed the blade open, hearing the click, feeling the strength of steel that had outlasted its first owner. On the handle, faint but visible, were initials carved by hand, R.H., whoever had placed it there, had meant for him to see those letters, to hold them, to know they belonged to someone before him. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The objects spread before him like pieces of puzzle. None of it made sense yet. Not fully. A photograph of a man he did not know, a medal engraved with history, a letter he had not yet read, a knife marked with initials. Each carried weight, but what bound them together remained hidden. The arrangement, though, was unmistakable. This was no accident. These things had been chosen, placed deliberately in the box, sent to him with purpose. He ran his hand across his face, exhaling slowly. The air in the room felt different now, heavier, as though the walls leaned closer. He looked again at the photograph, the stern man in uniform staring back across time. There was no recognition in his memory, no sudden spark of familiarity. Yet the eyes, the posture, they stirred something beneath the surface. The letter waited. He knew it held the explanation, or at least the beginning of one, but he could not bring himself to read it yet. Instead, he closed the pocket knife carefully, folded the cloth back around it, and placed it next to the metal. He stacked the photograph on top, the letter on the bottom, arranging them as they had been in the box, preserving the order as though it might matter later. He sat in the dimming light, staring at the cardboard shell, now empty, but still significant. Someone had sent him this box. Someone had known his name, his address, and chosen these items. It was not random. It was not chance. And though he could not yet see the shape of the message, he felt its presence pressing at the edges of his understanding. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a car passed, its tires hissing on wet pavement. Daniel remained still, his hands resting lightly on the desk, the objects before him glowing faintly in the last of the day's light. He did not know yet what they meant, but he knew this much: they had not come to him by mistake. Daniel reached for the photograph again, this time with a steadier hand. The small print felt fragile between his fingers, the kind of paper that seemed to hold not just an image but the weight of years. He tilted it toward the light, letting the dim rays from the window fall across its surface. The man in the picture stood stiffly, shoulders squared in his uniform, boots planted firmly on the earth in front of a modest house with clapboard siding. The uniform was older, from a generation before Daniel's own service, its cut an insignia belonging to a war he had studied but never lived. The man's face carried the sharp lines of youth, but his eyes were already marked with fatigue, the unmistakable look of someone who had seen too much, too soon. Daniel turned the photograph over and found handwriting on the back. It was deliberate, written in a careful hand, the ink faded but still legible. Asterisk for my son, to know where he comes from. Asterisk, a lump rose in Daniel's throat as he read the words again and again, his thumb brushing across them as if touch alone might reveal the story hidden there. Beside the photograph, tucked loosely against the edges of the box, was a small note. It was written on plain lined paper, folded once, the creases fresh compared to the age of the photograph. Daniel unfolded it carefully, smoothing the corners flat on the desk. The handwriting was different from the scrawl on the back of the photograph. Sharper, more recent, likely the same as the letter he had yet to read. The note said only this: asterisk, the man in the picture is my father. Yesterday, you helped me when you had no reason to. You didn't know me, but you saw me. My father was a soldier too. He taught me that kindness is the greatest service a person can give. I carry him with me every day, but yesterday, you reminded me of him. This is for you to know that his legacy is not forgotten. Asterisk. Daniel read the words slowly, each line sinking deeper than the last. He glanced back at the photograph, at the stern young man who now felt closer, no longer a stranger but part of a chain that had brushed against his own. The resemblance between the father in the photograph and the traveler he had helped in the diner came to mind. He had noticed it then, though only faintly, the same dark eyes, the same weight in the shoulders. He had thought it was simply the burden of the moment, but now he realized it was something older, inherited. He leaned back in his chair, letting the photograph rest against his palm. His mind drifted back to the diner, the quiet moment when he had reached into his wallet without thinking, covering a bill that had not been his. He had not done it for recognition, had not expected thanks. It was instinct, the kind of instinct drilled into him through years of service, watch, notice, step in when someone falters. Yet that simple gesture had rippled further than he could have imagined, reaching into strangers' past, tying him unexpectedly to another soldier's story. The room seemed smaller now, as though it were filled not only with Daniel in the box, but also with the presence of the man in the photograph. He studied the eyes again, the slight down under the mouth, the expression that hovered between resolve and weariness. Daniel had seen that same look in his own reflection more than once. The recognition tightened his chest, the sense that though they had never met, they had walked parallel paths separated only by time. He set the note carefully beside the photograph, aligning its edges as if order could help contain the emotions it stirred. His hand lingered on the desk, fingers resting lightly on the objects. He thought about the stranger, the way they had quietly gathered their belongings and left the diner after the meal, expression unreadable. He had wondered then what they carried with them. Now, he knew it had been more than hunger or worry. They had carried memory, grief, and a father's legacy that Daniel had unknowingly stepped into by paying for a simple meal. The silence stretched, but it did not feel empty. It felt charged, layered with history and unspoken gratitude. Daniel drew in a breath, held it, and let it out slowly. The photograph remained before him, the soldier's eyes fixed forward as if still standing guard. Daniel felt the weight of being linked, however briefly, to that watch. It humbled him, unsettled him, yet it also steadied something inside him that had long been restless. He placed the photograph back on the desk gently, his movements deliberate, as if returning it to its rightful place. The note he folded once more, slipping it into the box with care. For a long moment, he sat motionless, the object in front of him quiet but alive with meaning. A stranger's gratitude had reached him not in words spoken at a diner, but through a legacy preserved, carried forward, and handed to him without warning. Daniel's hand brushed across the metal and the knife still lying on the desk, but his eyes returned again and again to photograph. The face in it was no longer just an image. It was a bridge between lives, between wars, between silent gestures that bound one soldier to another across decades. Daniel lifted the photograph aside, his eyes falling to what lay just beneath it, resting in the bottom of the box. Cushioned by folded newspaper that had yellowed at the edges was a medal. The ribbon was frayed, its colors dull with age, but the metal disc itself gleamed faintly where it had been polished by years of handling. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his chest. He knew medals, had been around them for years, had seen them pinned to uniforms during ceremonies that always carried both pride and grief. But this one was different. This one bore the weight of a story he did not yet know, but already felt in his bones. He reached for it carefully, almost reverently, as though the small piece of bronze might crumble if he moved too quickly. The surface was cool against the skin, the etched design familiar, though belonging to an era just before his own service. His thumb traced the ridges, stopping at the engraved words on the back. They were simple, standard issue, but somehow heavier because he knew this medal had not come from his own hand, his own fight. It had been earned by another man, someone whose story now intersected unexpectedly with his own. At the bottom of the box was another slip of paper, smaller than the note that had explained the photograph. Daniel unfolded it with soldier's care, smoothing it out before reading. The words written there were brief, but they carried the kind of weight that could silence a room. Asterisk, this medal belonged to my father. He was given it after returning home from a deployment. He barely survived. He told me once that the medal itself never mattered. It was just metal. What mattered were the moments he chose to live by the values it was meant to represent. One of those moments came when he paid for another man's meal, a stranger who reminded him of himself. He never forgot that, and he told me to carry it forward. Asterisk. Daniel sat back in his chair, the medal resting in his palm, the note trembling slightly in his other hand. The words pressed into him with a force he hadn't expected. The connection was no longer just symbolic, no longer a faded photograph or a kind remembrance. It was tangible, something he could hold, something that carried both history and intention. The stranger in the diner had not simply given him their father's picture as a way of saying thank you. They had given him the physical reminder of a soldier's life, a piece of metal tied not only to battles fought, but to choices made long after the uniform was hung up. The medal felt heavier than it should, as though it carried not just the past, but the responsibility of remembering. Daniel thought about his own medals, tucked away in a drawer at the bottom of his duffel. He had not looked at them in months, maybe longer. They had always felt distant to him, awarded for moments that never seemed to capture the full truth of what he and his brothers in arms had lived. But this medal was different. It was not his, yet it felt closer to the essence of service than any he had received. His mind drifted back to the diner, to the quiet act of sliding a few bills across the counter before the stranger could protest. It had seemed small, barely worth remembering. Yet here it was, echoed across time, tied to another soldier who had once done the same. It was as if kindness itself had a lineage, passed from one set of weary hands to another, surviving war, poverty, and the distance between generations. Daniel placed the medal carefully on the desk beside the photograph. He studied them together, the face of the young soldier and the worn ribbon that had once been pinned to his chest. They belonged to each other, but now, in some inexplicable way, they also belonged to him. He thought about the stranger's words. Asterisk, carry it forward. Asterisk, they had not spoken them aloud, but they had written them, and in doing so had tied Daniel into that quiet promise. The weight of it pressed against him, not as a burden, but as a reminder. Service was never truly finished. It stretched beyond deployments, beyond uniforms, beyond medals pinned in ceremonies. It lived in the choices a person made long after parades were over, in gestures as simple as covering a meal for someone who could not. The man in the photograph had understood that. His child had understood it. And now, by sheer chance or perhaps by something more, Daniel was being asked to understand it too. The room around him was silent, except for the steady tick of the wall clock. Daniel let the sound anchor him as his thoughts turned inward. He felt a prick of tears at the corners of his eyes, though he blinked them back, unwilling to let them fall. It was not sorrow exactly, but something deeper, a recognition, a connection, an acknowledgement of the thread that now tied into strangers who felt less like strangers with every passing moment. He closed his hand gently around the medal one more time before setting it back in the box. His fingers lingered on the edge of the cardboard, his breathing slow and deliberate. He understood now that the box was not just a gift, it was a trust, and in receiving it, he had been pulled into a story that was no longer just his own. Daniel noticed there was still one more item inside the box, pressed flat against the bottom, as though it had been placed last on purpose. He reached for it carefully, his fingers brushing against the edges of a folded sheet of paper. The paper was slightly creased, as if it had been carried around for some time before being tucked into this parcel. When he unfolded it, he saw a handwriting that was neat but a little unsteady, as though each word had been written with deliberate care, the ink pressed hard enough into the paper to leave faint indentations. He began to read. The opening line was simple. Asterisk, this letter is not about the meal you paid for yesterday. It is about something greater. Asterisk, Daniel's eyes lingered there, already sensing the tone was going to reach into places he rarely allowed himself to visit. He read on. The writer explained how their father had lived his life with a quiet philosophy, one he rarely shared aloud, but always demonstrated in small ways. He believed, the letter continued, that service didn't end when a uniform was folded away. He believed it carried on in how a man treated others, how he noticed the tired eyes of a stranger, how he recognized a familiar way to struggle, and how he chose, when given a chance, to ease it. Daniel paused, feeling those words sit heavy in his chest. They weren't new to him, but seeing them written so plainly, tied to the medal and photograph on his table, gave them a sharper edge. The letter went on to explain that the stranger in the diner, the person who had received his quiet gesture, had grown up watching their father live by that creed. Sometimes it was as simple as fixing a neighbor's fence without being asked, or leaving food on a doorstep when hard times fell. Other times it was paying for a meal when someone else couldn't. These moments were never spoken of loudly, never worn as badges of honor, but they lingered, carried silently by those who had been on the receiving end. He told me that those acts mattered more than the parades, more than the speeches. He said those were the things that lasted. Daniel let the letter rest in his lap for a moment, staring at the wall. He thought of the countless times he had seen the same principle in action overseas, in ways both grand and invisible. a fellow soldier giving up the last sip from his canteen, a medic working through exhaustion because there was always one more body to tend to, a commander who refused to leave a man behind no matter how dangerous the retrieval. These acts, uncelebrated beyond the immediate circle, were what truly endured. The letter seemed to be stitching together his memories with someone else's, binding them into a single thread. As he continued reading, the handwriting grew slightly more personal. Yesterday, when you stepped forward and covered my bill, you did not know who I was. You did not know the story I carried or the man in the photograph. But in that moment, you lived out the same values my father lived by. You carried forward something he believed could not be lost as long as someone chose to embody it. That is why this letter is not really about the meal. It is about recognizing that the chain is unbroken. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he read those words. He wasn't a man who sought recognition, and he certainly hadn't expected any when he laid the money down at the diner counter. To him, it had been instinctive, almost automatic. But now, through this letter, he saw the act differently, not as a single gesture, but as part of a longer story, one that stretched back decades and had now found its way to him. The letter closed with gratitude, but not the kind that rang hollow. It was gratitude rooted in lineage, in continuity, in the acknowledgement that values to be inherited without blood, passed from one soldier to another across time. My father is gone now, the letter concluded, but yesterday I saw him again in your actions. For that, I thank you. For that, I know his legacy lives on. And for that, I will carry it forward myself. When Daniel set the letter down, the silence of his small rented room felt heavier, but also strangely alive. He looked again at the photograph, the medal, and finally the letter, all arranged before him like pieces of story he hadn't meant to enter but now belonged to. He rubbed his hands slowly together, as if steadying himself, before folding the letter back with the same care it had been written. For the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed himself to lean back and breathe deeply. He felt a sting in his eyes and didn't fight it this time. The tears that formed weren't about sorrow alone. They were about recognition, connection, and a quiet relief that his small action had meant something more than he could have imagined. In that moment, he understood that the meal, the medal, the photograph, and the letter were all part of the same truth. Service never truly ends, and dignity endures in the smallest of gestures, carried forward by those willing to keep the chain unbroken. Daniel sat at the small table, the box still open before him, its contents spread out in a way that looked both deliberate and accidental, as though time itself had arranged them there. The photograph, the medal, the folded letter, they seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the rented room. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap, and let the silence take him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't try to push away the thoughts that came. He let them surface, each one carrying its own weight. He remembered the long wooden benches of mess tents, where tin trays clattered with spoons and forks as men wolfed down whatever food was placed in front of them. The laughter of young soldiers, joking too loudly, trying to mask the tension that always lingered in the air. He remembered the quieter moments, when a man would slide half his portion across the table to someone who hadn't eaten in a while, or when coffee brewed strong enough to taste like mud was passed around as though it were gold. Food had been more than sustenance in those places. It had been a thread holding them together, proof they were still human in a world trying to strip that away. Faces rose and faded in his mind, comrades whose names he could never forget, though time had blurred their voices. There was Avery, who had kept a stash of chocolate bars in his pack and handed them out like treasures on the worst nights. There was Lewis, who once used his own rations to barter for medicine that saved another man's life. Each of them was gone now, their laughter and generosity carried only in memory, but Daniel felt them with him in that room. He realized how much of who he was had been shaped by those small exchanges, those unspoken acts of care that no headline would ever record. The photograph on the table seemed to stare back at him, the younger soldier in uniform frozen in a moment decades old. Daniel thought about the stranger's father, about how he must have lived his days after the uniform was gone, finding ways to pass on the quiet dignity of service without ever needing to speak of it. He thought of the way one man's act decades ago could ripple outward, shaping the choices of a son or daughter, and now, unexpectedly, binding his own life into theirs. The idea that live could intersect like that, not through grand design, but through the smallest gestures, humbled him. He closed his eyes and thought about the meals shared in villages far from home, where families with almost nothing would still set bread before them, refusing to let strangers leave hungry. He thought about the looks exchanged across tables, no common language needed, only the shared understanding that feeding another person was an act that bridged every difference. He realized how often kindness had been his lifeline, both the giving and the receiving of it. In those moments, the threads between people were invisible but undeniable, stretched across continents and generations. Sitting in that quiet room, Daniel understood that what he'd done in the diner wasn't just about covering the cost of a plate of food. It was about honoring something larger than himself, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. It was about keeping alive the unspoken agreements between those who had once shared the same burdens and the same fears. By stepping forward without a word, he had unknowingly joined a line of gestures that stretched backward and forward, binding strangers into something like family. The medal, resting in its case, carried its own weight. He had medals of his own, tucked away in a drawer, rarely looked at. But he knew what they represented. The lives entangled with his, the ones who didn't come back, the ones who had given everything. Holding another man's medal reminded him that sacrifice wasn't singular. It existed in layers, passed from generation to generation, as much about the living who carried the memory as the dead who had earned it. As the silence deepened, Daniel felt tears forming again, but he didn't resist them. They weren't just for loss. They were for connection, for the men he had served with, for the stranger in the diner, for the father in the photograph, for every unseen thread that tied their lives together. He realized that even in his solitude, he was not alone. The memories, the reflections, and the unseen bonds made his life part of something larger, something that did not end when the uniforms were folded or battles faded into history. He sat there for a long time, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on the object before him. The room was quiet, but it felt full, as though every comrade, every meal, every kindness he had ever known was sitting with him. And in that stillness, Daniel understood that memory was not just about holding on to the past. It was about recognizing the threads that continued to weave themselves into his present, guiding him, reminding him that no act of service, however small, was ever truly forgotten. The diner felt different that afternoon, though everything inside remained the same. The coffee pot hissed in the background, plates clattered against each other, and a radio murmured a tune that few paid attention to. Daniel sat in his usual place near the window, a half-eaten sandwich resting on the plate in front of him. He had come back out of routine more than hunger, needing a familiar space after the way of the morning. His mind was still on the box at home, the photograph and medal laid carefully on the table, as though they were waiting for him. He thought he had been given his moment of connection already, a gesture that would live quietly in his memory. But then the door swung open with a faint chime, and he noticed a figure who stepped inside. It was a stranger from the night before. Their coat was the same, worn and a little frayed at the cuffs, their shoulders still carrying the weight of unspoken struggles. Daniel recognized the way they scanned the room, careful, hesitant, as if uncertain of their place in it. He expected them to take a booth in the corner, to fade into background as they had before, but instead their eyes found him almost immediately. For a moment, both stayed still, as though testing the reality of seeing one another again. The stranger crossed the floor slowly, each step deliberate, their hands resting against the strap of a bag slung over their shoulder. There was no fanfare, no rush of words spilling out. When they stopped at his table, the hum of conversation around them seemed to dull. Daniel looked up, nodding once in quiet recognition, the way soldiers did when words felt unnecessary. The stranger returned the nod, then asked softly, almost apologetically, if the seat across from him was taken. Daniel motioned with a simple gesture for them to sit. They settled into the booth with an awkwardness that quickly gave way to a calm silence. Neither tried to force conversation. Instead, they sat together, two people who had already shared something significant without a single spoken promise. Daniel noticed a faint redness around the stranger's eyes, as though tears had been there earlier, wiped away, but still lingering. He didn't ask. He knew better than to press. A waitress approached, placing a glass of water on the table for the stranger, and then left them alone. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but waited. Daniel let his gaze rest on the stranger without prying, giving them room to speak when they were ready. Finally, they reached into their bag and pulled out a small notebook, worn at the edges. They placed it carefully on the table, sliding it across toward him, not with dramatic flair, but with a kind of reverence reserved for something deeply personal. "I want to thank you," the stranger said, their voice steady but low. "Not just for yesterday, for what you reminded me of." Daniel kept his eyes on the notebook, but didn't reach for it immediately. He waited, knowing there was more. The stranger continued, explaining that the man in the photograph, the soldier whose medal now lay in Daniel's room, had once done for others what Daniel had done for them. A small kindness, offered without expectation, had carried through decades. The stranger's voice wavered as they admitted that they had doubted such acts still existed, that the world had felt colder, harsher. And then Daniel's gesture, simple as it was, had broken through that doubt. Daniel finally took the notebook, running his roughened fingers over the cover. He didn't open it yet, sensing that its pages held something not meant to be rushed. He looked at the stranger and offered a quiet response, the only one that felt right. "We just take care of each other. That's all it is." The stranger smiled faintly at that, a weary but genuine expression, as if they had been waiting to hear words like those. Around them, the diner continued its rhythm. Orders called out, spoons clinking against cups, the door opening and shutting, but at that table, time felt slower. Daniel realized the gift was not finished. It was still unfolding, piece by piece, in ways neither of them had expected. They sat together for a while longer, speaking little, but the silence was no longer heavy. It had shifted into something almost comfortable, almost familiar, as though they were no longer strangers at all. When the stranger finally rose to leave, they placed a hand briefly on the edge of the table, grounding themselves before stepping away. Daniel didn't try to stop them. Some meetings weren't meant to be held on to forever. They were meant to be lived in the moment and carried forward in memory. As the door closed behind them, Daniel looked down at the notebook resting in front of him. He hadn't opened it yet, but he felt its weight, not of paper, but a connection. The gift he had thought ended with the box was still expanding, reaching into his life in ways he hadn't expected. And as he sat alone once more, the sandwich now cold, he realized that sometimes the most important conversations happen without needing to fill the air with words at all. The notebook lay between them like a quiet invitation, its scuffed cover marked by years of handling. Daniel didn't open it right away. He let it sit there waiting while the stranger took a slow breath, gathering the courage to speak. The diner continued its steady rhythm around them, forks scraping against plates, a coffee pot being refilled somewhere out of sight, laughter from a group of teenagers near the door. None of it seemed to intrude on the space that had settled at their table, as if they were enclosed in their own pause within the world's noise. The stranger leaned forward, hands clasped together on the table. Their voice began softly, carrying the weight of memory. They spoke of the man in the photograph, their father, who had once returned home from a war with very little but his uniform and the dignity he carried in silence. He had struggled to adjust, the stranger explained, taking small jobs, drifting between towns, never quite belonging anywhere. Yet he had a way of noticing those who struggled as he did. A mother counting coins at a bus stop. A young man turned away from a diner counter because he couldn't cover the bill. Each time, he would step in without hesitation, offering what little he had, never seeking acknowledgement. The stranger's voice wavered when they said that most of what they knew of him came not from his own words, but from the stories others shared long after he was gone. Letters arrived over the years from people who remembered him, from families who had been lifted, however briefly, by his presence. He never wrote about those moments. He just lived them. That medal, the stranger said, their hand brushing the table lightly as though it were resting on something invisible, wasn't about battles. It was about the way he carried himself when no one was watching. Daniel listened with his head slightly bowed, his thumb rubbing along the edge of his coffee cup. He could picture the man easily, though he had never met him. The description resonated with the echoes of people he had served alongside, men and women who bore their hardships quietly and carried others when they could. When the stranger's voice faltered, Daniel finally lifted his gaze, offering the steadiness of someone who understood without needing every detail. After a pause, he spoke, his words measured and low. He shared pieces of his own story, fragments he rarely voiced. He told of nights spent in distant deserts, meals rationed and shared among those who had less, moments of silence after the noise of battle, when men sat together without speaking, knowing they had carried each other through another day. He admitted that sometimes he had doubted whether those sacrifices meant anything once the uniform was folded away. But seeing the box, the photograph, the medal, it reminded him that meaning often outlived the ones who gave it shape. The stranger nodded slowly, eyes glassy but fixed on him with intent, as though holding on to every syllable. There was no pity in their expression, only recognition. He used to say, the stranger added after a moment, that kindness is just another form of service, that it's the kind of service that lasts. The words settled over the table like a benediction. Daniel let them linger before answering. Then he wasn't wrong, he said simply. His tone was neither grand nor heavy. It was matter of fact, the way soldiers spoke of truths too large to embellish. Around them, the diner's rhythm carried on. Plates clattered, silverware chimed, conversations rose and fell, but the noise only seemed to deepen the intimacy of their exchange. They weren't removed from the world. They were part of it, anchored by the sounds of ordinary life, while speaking of things extraordinary in their quiet endurance. The stranger's hand moved toward the notebook again, sliding it closer to him. He kept this with him always, they explained. It's filled with scraps, thoughts, moments, names of people he never wanted to forget. I don't know why, but I felt you should have it for a while. Maybe because what you did reminded me of him more than anything has in years. Daniel rested his palm on the notebook gently, feeling the roughness of the cover. He didn't promise to keep it or to give it back. Promises weren't necessary. What passed between them was not about possession, but about carrying something forward, just as the medal had carried a story through time. They spoke more after that, not as strangers, but as two people bound by the weight of memory and the honor of those who had come before them. Each word built a bridge, plank by plank, until the distance between their lives felt narrower, as though their paths had always been meant to cross in this ordinary diner. And when the conversation finally paused, neither felt the need to fill the silence. It was enough to know that some exchanges did not end when the talking stopped. They carried on, quietly, in the space between hearts that had learned to endure. Daniel rose from the booth with the box held close against his chest, the notebook tucked safely inside, the photograph and medal resting, as though they had always belonged to him. The stranger remained seated, watching quietly, their expression not one of farewell but of recognition, as though they both understood something had shifted in the space between them. For a moment, Daniel stood still, the chatter of the diner moving around him, waitresses balancing plates, the doorbell jingling as customers came and went, the rhythm of ordinary life continuing untouched. Yet for him, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He stepped outside, the late afternoon sun hitting his face, the light sharper than he expected. The town's main street stretched out in front of him, familiar in its smallness. Brick storefronts, faded signs, the steady hum of traffic rolling past. He began to walk, slow at first, almost hesitant, as though his legs needed to catch up to the weight in his arms. Every few steps he glanced down at the box, not in suspicion anymore, but in reverence, as though carrying something far larger than cardboard and tape. People passed him without notice, but he no longer blended into the background the way he had when he first entered the diner the night before. There was something different in his stride, a quiet straightness to his shoulders. He still looked tired, his boots still worn from years of use, but he no longer felt invisible. The box had made him visible again, at least himself. As he walked, memories stirred with each sound and sight. The clatter of a passing truck reminded him of convoys under a burning foreign sun. A faint echo of children's laughter across the street carried him back to makeshift game soldiers had organized in dusty villages, fleeting attempts to carve out normalcy. Even the smell of grease drifting from a nearby gas station made him think of nights spent huddled around improvised stoves, passing rations from hand to hand. Every piece of his past seemed to surface, But this time they didn't weigh him down. Instead, they connected him to the box in his arms, as if the objects inside anchored not just his story but countless others. The tears came without warning, stinging at first, then rolling freely down his face. He didn't try to stop them, didn't swipe them away. He let them fall, streaking his weathered skin, washing away years of silence. A passerby glanced at him briefly, then looked away, not out of dismissal, but out of respect for a moment too personal to intrude upon. Daniel kept walking, his vision blurred, the town around him softening into shapes and light, while the box remained sharp and solid against his chest. He thought of the meal, how simple it had been. Coffee cooling in his cup, the stranger across the room fumbling with a thin wallet. The instinct to step forward before hesitation could stop him. It had not been sacrifice. It had not been performance. It had been an act so ordinary he might have forgotten it within days. And yet, here he was, carrying proof that no act of kindness ever truly disappears. It folds itself into someone else's story, resurfaces years later, decades later, when it is most needed. He had believed his gesture ended at the counter of the diner, but now he saw it was part of a longer chain, invisible yet unbroken. The box grew heavier in his arms the farther he carried it, not because of weight, but because of meaning. Each step drove the truth deeper into him. He was not alone, had never been alone. Every soldier who had ever offered a hand, every stranger who had ever stepped in to ease another's burden, every quiet act of decency had woven itself into this moment. He was one link in that chain, and through him it would continue. By the time he reached the narrow stairs leading up to his rented room, Daniel's tears had slowed, replaced by a steadier rhythm of breath. He paused at the bottom step, looking down at the box once more. The handwriting on the top no longer felt like a mystery. It was an invitation, a reminder, and perhaps even a responsibility. He shifted the box gently, holding it as though it were fragile, though he knew it was sturdy. Then he began to climb, step by step, not hurried, not heavy, simply sure. Inside, the room was the same, plain walls, a folded blanket, boots lined neatly by the door. Yet, when he set the box down on the table, the space felt different, warmer, less empty. He sat beside it, his hand resting on the lid, and allowed himself to breathe in the quiet. He had walked away changed. What he had given without thought had returned to him multiplied. Proof that kindness circles back, carrying with it the weight of history, memory, and the unseen ties that hold people together. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt that the silence of his life was not emptiness, but peace.